My dad looked me in the eye across the kitchen table and told me he transferred my grandmother's trust money to my brother's account. Then he leaned back in his chair like he'd just solved something. He's starting a family, he said. He needs it more. My fiancé was sitting right beside me. He didn't say anything. He just reached into his jacket pocket and set his phone on the table, face up. I'll get back to that. I grew up in Sudbury, Ontario, in a house that always felt slightly too small for the distance between my dad and me. Not physically small, it was a decent-sized bungalow on Kathleen Street, the kind with a carport and a garden my mom used to keep up before her knees went bad. But emotionally, there was never quite enough room for me in it. My brother Garrett is 4 years older. When we were kids, people always said he had my dad's temperament, calm on the surface, immovable underneath. I think what they meant was that both of them could shut a door in a conversation and you'd never find the handle again. I was the opposite. I asked too many questions. I pushed too hard. My dad used to say I had a lot of feelings for a small person, and he never said it kindly. My mom tried. I want to be fair to her. She'd slip me extra money for school trips when she thought my dad wasn't watching, and she'd sit with me at the kitchen counter after dinner while I did homework, just existing nearby. But she never contradicted him. Not once in 30 years that I ever saw. Whatever he decided was law, and she learned early that questioning it cost more than it was worth. Garrett never had to question anything. He got the car at 16 even though he failed his road test the first time. He got help with his university application. When he dropped out of Laurentian after 2 years, my dad called it finding his path and lent him $12,000 to start a landscaping business that lasted about 8 months. When I deferred my acceptance to Carleton because I couldn't afford residence, nobody offered me anything. I'm not saying Garrett is a bad person. He's not. He's my brother. But he grew up knowing the floor would always hold, and I grew up knowing I was on my own. My grandmother, my dad's mother, Grandma Ruth, saw it. She never said so directly, but she saw it. She lived out in Espanola, and we'd drive out on Sunday afternoons sometimes. And she'd always find a reason to spend a few minutes alone with me in her kitchen. While the others watched football, she'd make tea. I didn't even like and talk to me about nothing in particular, and I understood even then that she was just making sure I knew someone was paying attention. When she died 3 years ago, she left behind a small estate. The house went to my dad, which was expected. But she also had a registered account, her RRSP, that she'd converted to a RIF when she retired, with some residual savings on top, totaling around $48,000. She'd told me once, just once, sitting at that kitchen table with the tea I didn't like, that she'd set something aside for me. She said she wanted me to have a real start. She said it like it mattered that I heard it. I assumed my dad was managing it while the estate settled. I didn't push. That was my mistake. I met Callum at a work conference in Ottawa in the fall 2 years ago. I was there representing the environmental consulting firm I worked for. He was there for reasons I didn't fully understand until much later. He was quiet in a way that wasn't awkward. The kind of quiet that means someone is listening, really listening, while everyone else in the room is waiting for their turn to talk. We ended up at the same table for lunch, and he made me laugh twice, which sounds small but wasn't, because I'd been having a genuinely terrible week. We exchanged numbers. I didn't expect anything. He texted 3 days later, which I'd already told myself was too much to hope for. We dated long distance for 7 months, him in Vancouver, me in Sudbury, before I took a position at a firm in Burnaby and moved west. My dad called that following a man across the country, like I hadn't spent 6 months applying for jobs and negotiating salary and arranging my own move down to the U-Haul reservation. But that was his read on it, and I'd stopped trying to correct his reads on things a long time ago. Callum and I got engaged last spring, quietly on a hiking trail above Squamish. No grand gesture, no ring hidden in a dessert. He'd asked me the week before if I'd want to get married, and I'd said yes before he finished the sentence. So by the time we were officially engaged, it felt less like a surprise and more like something being confirmed. I liked that. It suited us. We set a date for the following September. Small wedding. Maybe 40 people, venue up near Whistler. Nothing extravagant. We were paying for most of it ourselves, which was fine. We didn't need anything we couldn't afford. What I didn't know was that my dad had been sitting on $48,000 that was supposed to be mine. I found out the same way I find out most things in my family, sideways. My aunt, my dad's younger sister, who lives in Chelmsford, let something slip at Easter dinner. She'd been asking about the wedding, and I mentioned we were keeping it simple, doing a lot of the logistics ourselves to stay within budget. She looked at me in a way that suggested she thought I already knew something, and then she said, carefully, "Well, at least Garrett's portion of Ruth's estate helped with his house." I kept my face completely still. "Right," I said. Later I called her and asked her to explain. She was quiet for a long time. Then she told me that after my grandmother's estate had settled, my dad had transferred the savings, the account Grandma Ruth had specifically mentioned to me, into Garrett's name to help with the down payment on the house he and his girlfriend were buying in Barrie. My aunt had assumed my dad had spoken to me. He had not. I sat with that for 2 weeks before I said anything. I needed to be sure I wasn't going to cry. I needed to go in as someone who already knew the answer, not someone who was hoping to hear one. I called my dad on a Thursday evening. Callum was in the kitchen making dinner, and I went to our bedroom and shut the door. And I said as evenly as I could manage, "Dad, I need to talk to you about Grandma Ruth's savings account." He was quiet for a beat too long. Then he said, "What about it?" Not a question, a wall. I said, "I know you transferred it to Garrett. I'd like to understand why." He said, he was buying a home, he needed it. I said, "Grandma Ruth told me she set that money aside for me." He said, "Your grandmother was sentimental. She didn't understand how these things work. Garrett is starting a family. He needed a stable place to live." I said, "I'm also starting a family. I'm getting married." He said, "You're doing fine. You have a good job." Garrett was struggling. I asked how much had gone to Garrett. He said, "The full amount." It made more sense. I sat there in our bedroom with the door shut, and I listened to my dad explain, in a voice that suggested he was doing me a favor by not being irritated with me, that my grandmother's money she had told me was mine, money she had saved to give me a real start, had gone to my brother because my brother needed it more. And he sounded, across the phone line, exactly like he had at that kitchen table. Calm. Certain. Done. I said, "Okay," and I hung up. I went back to the kitchen and sat down across from Callum, and I told him all of it. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "What do you want to do?" I said I didn't know yet. He nodded and put a bowl of pasta in front of me, and we ate dinner and talked about other things, and I understood, sitting there, that this was what it felt like to be in the right relationship. Not someone who told me what to feel or what to do, just someone asking what I wanted. What I wanted was for my dad to explain himself in person. I think part of me still believed that if I could see his face, I'd find some logic I'd missed, some version of events that made the decision reasonable. I've since accepted that I was wrong about that, but at the time it still felt possible. We planned a visit to Ontario in June anyway, a combination of a work trip for Callum and time with family before the wedding. I told my parents we'd come for Sunday dinner. My brother and his girlfriend, Melissa, were going to be there too. I didn't tell anyone what I knew. I wanted to see how they behaved when they assumed I was still in the dark. My dad opened the door when we arrived and shook Callum's hand. My mom hugged me for a long time. Garrett was already inside with Melissa, and he was warm and easy, the way he always is. And it cost me something to hug him back and pretend. Dinner was roast chicken. My mom had made her potato salad, the one with the celery seed. For most of the meal, the conversation was safe. Melissa's work, the garden, A fishing trip my dad and Garrett had taken up to Lake Nipissing in May. Callum was quiet but engaged, asking questions, refilling water glasses, the way he does when he's observing a room. About halfway through dinner, my dad started asking about the wedding. How many people? Where exactly? What it was going to cost. He framed the questions as interest. But there was a particular quality to his attention, a sharpness, that I'd learned over the years meant he was calculating something. I answered plainly. I mentioned we were handling most of the costs ourselves. I watched my dad nod. Then Melissa, who I think genuinely didn't know the full picture, said something about how nice it must be that Callum's work was flexible, and asked what exactly it was he did. My dad looked at Callum with the particular expression he uses when he's decided someone isn't quite worth full attention. Something in tech, right? He said, like it wasn't worth the effort to remember more specifically. Callum said, environmental data infrastructure, mostly. Software that helps companies track and report on their emissions obligations. My dad made a sound that was not quite a response. My brother asked where the company was based. Callum said, Vancouver mostly. We have a small team in Toronto now. Nobody asked anything further. The conversation moved back to Garrett's house, to the renovation they were planning for the back deck, to whether cedar or composite held up better in Ontario winters. Callum looked at me across the table. I knew that look. It meant, when you're ready. I put down my fork. I said, Dad, I want to talk about Grandma Ruth's account. The table went quiet in the specific way, the way it does when everyone suddenly understands that what's coming was always coming and the small talk was just delay. My dad said, this isn't the time. I said, I've been waiting for you to bring it up. You haven't. So I'm bringing it up. He said, your grandmother's estate was handled appropriately. I said, she told me that money was for me. She told me directly. My mom was looking at her plate. Garrett said quietly, Meg. I looked at him. Did you know? He didn't answer fast enough. I said, how much of it went to the down payment? My dad said, this is a private matter. I said, it stopped being private when you transferred $48,000 without telling me. My dad's voice went very even, the way it does just before he decides he's done engaging. He said, Garrett was in a difficult position. He needed a stable home. You're doing fine. You have Callum. Callum, who had been completely still, looked up at that. I said, what does Callum have to do with my grandmother's money? My dad said, you're not struggling. Garrett was struggling. Your grandmother would have understood. I said, she told me in her kitchen that she wanted me to have a real start. She said it because she knew I wasn't getting one from anywhere else. My mom made a small sound. My dad said, you have a job. You have a fiancé. What exactly did you think you were owed? That word, owed, the way he said it, like I was being unreasonable for believing a dead woman's word meant anything. Callum set down his fork. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out his phone and placed it on the table face up. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't adjust his expression particularly. He said, I want to make sure I understand what you're saying. You decided that the money Ruth left for Megan should go to Garrett, and you didn't tell her. And your position is that she shouldn't feel she's owed anything because she has a job and she has me. My dad said, that's correct. Callum said, can I ask, do you know what I do, specifically? My dad said, tech, software, you said. Callum said, the company I co-founded does environmental data reporting. We license our platform to municipalities and large corporations who need to meet federal emissions reporting requirements. We went through a Series B round 18 months ago. The valuation came out at a little over $90 million. He said it the way someone states a fact they neither need to apologize for nor perform modesty about. Just information, placed on the table. Nobody spoke. Callum said, I'm not telling you that because it changes what happened to Ruth's money. It doesn't. That money was Megan's, and the fact that I have resources doesn't make taking it from her acceptable. I'm telling you because you just used me as your justification. You said she has a job and she has me, like I'm a substitute for what you took. I want you to understand that I'm not a substitute for anything. Megan would be standing here saying exactly this whether she'd ever met me or not. Garrett said, Callum. Callum said, I'm not finished. He picked up his phone. He said, I've been sitting here all evening watching the way you speak to her. I watched you not remember what I do for a living because you'd already decided I wasn't worth knowing. I watched you redirect a conversation about your daughter's wedding to your son's renovation. I watched you explain to her just now that she shouldn't expect to be treated fairly because she has me to fall back on. He paused. Megan grew up in this house. She came here tonight giving you a chance to be honest with her. She sat through dinner. And the best you could offer her was you should feel lucky you have your fiancé. My dad's jaw was tight. My mom was crying very quietly, and I didn't know if it was for me or just because there was conflict in the room. And I realized I'd stopped being able to tell the difference. Garrett looked at me. He said, Meg, I didn't know she'd told you specifically. I thought Dad had talked to you. I said, did you ask? He didn't answer. I said, I'm not angry at you, Garrett. I mean, I am, a little. But mostly I'm just tired. I looked at my dad. I'm tired of being the one who doesn't need anything. I'm tired of that being the whole explanation. My dad said I made the decision I thought was right. I said, I know you did. I folded my napkin and set it on the table. Callum was already standing. I said, I'm not going to spend the rest of this dinner pretending everything is fine. I think we should go. My mom stood up and said my name once, in the voice she uses when she's asking me not to make something real by naming it. I hugged her because she's my mom, and I love her even when she can't protect me. I didn't hug my dad. We drove back to the hotel in near silence, not an uncomfortable silence, just the kind that happens when both people have said enough and don't need to add to it yet. At a red light on Paris Street, Callum said, Are you okay? I thought about it. I think so. I think I've been not okay about this for a long time, and tonight it just finally had a name. He nodded. I said, Thank you for what you said in there. He said, I meant it. I said, I know, that's why I'm thanking you. In the weeks that followed, my dad sent me 2 text messages. The first said he thought I'd been unfair to him in front of the family. The second said he hoped I'd come to understand that he'd done what he thought was best. I didn't respond to either one. My mom called twice. The first call she spent mostly explaining his perspective, which I listened to without engaging. The second call at the end, she said very quietly, I should have said something to him a long time ago. She didn't say it like an apology exactly, but I understood what it was, and I told her I loved her, and I meant it. Garrett and I had a longer conversation. I let him call me, and I let him explain, and I told him what Grandma Ruth had said to me in that kitchen in Espanola, and he was quiet for a while. And then he said he was sorry. He said it plainly, without conditions attached, and that mattered. I told him we'd be okay. I think we will be. He and Melissa are coming to the wedding. My parents are not. That's not a decision I made out of anger or revenge. It's a decision I made because I looked at who they are, who they've always been, and I realized that having them there on the day I'm starting the life I actually want would cost me something I'm not willing to spend anymore. I invited them because I believe in giving people chances. They declined to RSVP for 3 weeks, and then my mom called to say they'd probably come, and I'd already made my peace with it either way, and I told her the RSVP cutoff had passed. I'm not sure my dad has registered that his behavior has consequences. I don't know if he ever will. That stopped being my problem somewhere around exit 470 on the Trans-Canada. driving away from a house that never quite made room for me, beside a person who always does. We got married in September on a clear Saturday at a lodge just outside Whistler. 41 people. My aunt from Chelmsford came, which meant more to me than I expected. 2 of Callum's sisters flew in from Halifax. My best friend officiated and cried through half of it, which made me cry too, and Callum stood there looking like someone who had nowhere else he'd rather be. Grandma Ruth's money went to my brother's deck. I don't know if it's cedar or composite. What I have is this: a husband who sat at my father's table and said, plainly and without performance, that I deserved better. A career I built myself, in a city I chose, doing work I actually care about. A marriage that started the way I always hoped one would, not with someone rescuing me, but with someone standing next to me while I stood up for myself. I think about Grandma Ruth sometimes. I think about her kitchen and the tea I didn't like, and the way she'd look at me when she said things she needed me to remember. I think she'd be glad about most of it. The tea she'd probably let go. The rest, I think she'd say I got the real start she wanted for me. It just came from somewhere she didn't expect. I keep coming back to that kitchen in Española. The tea I didn't like. The way Grandma Ruth looked at me when she said she'd set something aside. Not like she was doing me a favor, but like she was correcting something that had always been slightly off balance. She saw it. She didn't make a speech about it. She just quietly tried to fix it, the only way she had left. That's the thing about people who actually have integrity. They don't announce it. They just do the thing, and they trust you to understand it later. What happened with my dad wasn't a one-time lapse in judgment. It was a pattern that had been running my whole life, and the money was just the moment it became impossible to explain away. He made a decision that wasn't his to make, didn't tell me, and when I found out, his response was to explain why he'd been right. That's not a mistake. That's a worldview. And once I understood that, I stopped waiting for an apology that was never going to come in the form I needed it. Callum said something at that dinner table I've thought about many times since. He said I would be standing there saying exactly what he said, whether I'd ever met him or not. He was right. That's the part that mattered most to me. Not that he defended me, but that he understood the defense wasn't about him. It was about me having always known what I deserved, and spending years in a house that told me I was wrong about that. I think the hardest thing isn't being treated unfairly. It's the slow erosion that happens when you're treated unfairly by people who are supposed to love you, and you start to wonder if they're right. If maybe you really are asking for too much. If maybe the fact that you're fine means you don't need anything. I spent a long time in that fog. Coming out of it wasn't dramatic. It was just a series of small decisions to trust my own read on things, to build a life that reflected what I actually valued, to stop shrinking myself to fit into rooms that were never going to expand for me. Garrett and I are okay. That matters to me. He made a choice he shouldn't have made, but when I gave him the chance to be honest, he took it. That's not nothing, knowing the difference between people who can't face what they've done and people who just hadn't faced it yet. That's something I've had to learn to see clearly, and it's worth seeing clearly. I got married in September in a place that felt like mine. 41 people who actually wanted to be there. My aunt cried. My best friend forgot half her efficient speech and winged the rest of it beautifully. Callum held my hand through the whole thing like he had nowhere else to be. Grandma Ruth wanted me to have a real start. I think the real start wasn't the money. It was learning, slowly and sometimes painfully, that I was worth the effort of building something solid. That took longer than $48,000 would have. It also turned out to be worth more.